Dzień dobry, witam Państwa. Jesteśmy w hotelu Presidential w Warszawie i dzięki gościnności tego miejsca możemy zorganizować i przeprowadzić dzisiejszą debatę w Układzie Sił. My name is Marek Stefan, I'm an editor-in-chief in Układ Sił and welcome all of you in strategic debate on our YouTube channel. Great power rivalry has once again become a central issue of international relations. How is the grand strategy of United States taking shape in this geopolitical environment? What are the strategic objectives of the major power and how they define victory in ongoing confrontation? Are we facing a return to a geopolitical bloc rivalry resembling the Cold War decades, or will the great power politics in the 21st century more closely resemble context among powers in the 19th and early mid-20th centuries? Those and another questions will be addressed today. Today's discussion by Professor Hal Brands, an American columnist, scholar of US foreign policy. He is a Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, as well as resident scholar of American Enterprise Institute. He is also author of several books, including Eurasia Century, which also has been published in Polish. Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Jacek Bartosiak, geopolitical expert, a writer and founder of Strategy and Future think tank. Hello,
yeah,
Jacek.
Thanks for having me.
So my first question to you, because we are talking June 16, we have some rumors about the deal between United States and Iran. Who won this war?
It's a messy outcome, which means that it's a disappointing outcome from the perspective of the United States and particularly from the perspective of Israel. I think when President Trump went into this war, he hoped that at the very least he could sort of defang the Iranian regime militarily, and maybe the US and Israel would somehow bring about a moderation or a toppling of the regime in Tehran. Unfortunately, we have mostly gotten the opposite, and so I don't mean to deprecate the sort of military achievements of the U.S. and Israel, which in some ways were very impressive. But the Iranians were able to contest traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. They were able to sustain their retaliatory campaign against the Persian Gulf countries in particular. And it appears that basically the essence of the deal that is going to be signed later this week is simply an effort to get back to the status quo ante. So the U.S. will lift its blockade, the Iranians will lift their blockade of Hormuz, and all of the difficult issues regarding Iran's nuclear program, its missile program, its regional behavior are either unaddressed or will be kicked to future negotiations. And so if you look at the set of objectives that the U.S. and Israel came into the war with, it's hard to consider this a major success.
Mm-hmm. Jacek, what's your point of view?
Yeah, of course, it depends on what angle you look at. Basically, the U.S. lost this war. It's a strategic failure by the United States, and it was one of the campaigns of the systemic war that was triggered by Trump's decision during the first term to initiate trade war against China and technological war. That was the war that started over the system of the world capitalism, right? So, and the world order, as we or the great power competition, whatever you call it, whatever you label it, and this was a major campaign, like Alcibiades' campaign in Sicily during the Peloponnesian War, and the United States decisively lost it. It will have major consequences. This is the second time that the United States faced a strategic defeat. The first one was unfolding in a twofold fashion. The collapse of the deterrence at the outbreak of the war between Russia and Ukraine, because the United States didn't want and warned that this would be consequential, and still Russia did it. And the second, loss of control over the prospects of Ukraine. So Zelensky 3 times defeated Trump's pressure to end war on American terms in order to have a deal with Russia, and Ukraine said no. And the United States doesn't have leverage over Ukraine. And it's amazing how many Americans don't get it, don't understand the strategic consequences in the region and elsewhere. So this is the second campaign that Americans lost. So the US primacy is gone. It was confirmed now in this campaign. And now what next? We can discuss in the next question.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree that the American, the era of American primacy is gone?
I'm not sure I would go quite that far. I think just in terms of kind of material indices of power, the US still has a pretty significant lead over anybody else. I think what's true is that perceptions of the efficacy of US power have been significantly eroded by this war. Not simply by the failure to prevent Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz, but also as a result of the perception that the United States was sort of improvising its way through this terrible global crisis because it hadn't planned sufficiently for the way that Iran might retaliate, because President Trump was sort of threatening radical escalation one moment and saying peace was at hand the next moment. And so I think there has been a significant dent to sort of the perception of the United States as a country that can act competently and efficiently on the global stage. That doesn't have to be permanent, but in the near term, I think it absolutely does create a global impression that American power is less impressive than it might have seemed at the outset of this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue the opposite in both dimensions. So first of all, I think that in terms of the perception and ideology, United States is still a predominant power, and it wants to have the agency in Eurasia, and it creates perception, including the Donald Trump's writings on social media, that it still calls the shots. And in many quarters, including some in Poland and in Europe, believe so, that we are still in primacy and they behave adequately. But in terms of a material side, since long time, US doesn't have primacy, and there are two evidences of that: war in Ukraine and war in Iran, and other aspects, including, the statistics, in terms of the material strength of China and US. So the times when the United States have preponderance is long behind us, but still the old Windows, the operational system, how the world operates, is still the American one. And the old addictions, ways, the old fashions, how we've been dealing. And this is the problem, because if there is this imbalance between reality and perceptions, usually this bluff is called. And this is what I fear in Eurasia. Yeah? And the problem is that the United States is far away behind the ocean, and it will not face the direct consequences of that. Nations in Eurasia will, especially allies of the United States. If the United States' new posture is not properly addressed and consulted with the allies adequately, because rhetorics will not suffice. Yeah? We can also discuss it in detail later.
Mm-hmm. I also ask you about this, the dynamic of the relation between United States and its allies. But first, Professor Brands, in your essay for foreign policy in March of this year, you outlined three possible scenarios that could shape the transformation of the current international system. As you wrote, one possibility is the two-world scenario, reminiscent the Cold War, in which the globe is divided into rival blocs led by Washington and Beijing. A second possibility is an age not of two blocs, but the several empires, in which a number of powerful actors carve out regional sphere of influence. And the first possibility is the self-help world, in which US behavior turns predatory and pushes the system into the anarchic abyss. Which of these three visions of the world you find most convincing?
I think the challenge of our current moment is that you can see evidence of all three of these worlds that are potentially emerging. And so there has been a trend toward sharper US-China competition, which lends itself to kind of the new Cold War scenario over a decade or more, although it's grown a little bit more ambiguous during President Trump's second term in office. President Trump often seems as though he's attracted to the idea of regional spheres of influence. And so there's a certain part of him that believes that Ukraine basically belongs in Russia's sphere of influence. And this is one of the reasons he's repeatedly tried to push Zelensky to make an unfavorable peace there. And then there are aspects of President Trump's behavior, the emphasis on territorial aggrandizement, taking Greenland from Denmark and so on and so forth, that fit in the third category. And so what makes our current moment feel so uncertain and contingent is that you can see elements of all three models in American behavior right now. If I had to predict which one of the three is most likely to result, I think it is most likely to be the first of the three worlds, the two-world scenario, the new Cold War scenario, in part just because there are going to be natural forces of rivalry between the U.S. and China, as they are the most important, powerful actors in the international system. And that rivalry is probably going to have a certain polarizing effect on the international environment as both countries sort of try to line up friends and allies on their side. And so I think structurally the world is most likely to evolve in that direction, but contingency and choice matters as well. And the way I end the essay is pointing out that you could get very different approaches to U.S. policy based on the outcomes of what will be a series of very close elections between now and, say, the middle of the 2030s. And that's why it's hard to put a firm prediction on whether it's going to be 1, 2, or 3.
Mm-hmm. That's okay.
Yeah, I somewhat agree with this argument pertaining to three scenarios. Let me briefly summarize my slight deviation from those outcomes. If the United States decided, as Stephen Walt wrote in Foreign Affairs, decided to be a predator hegemon, it will fail. It will fail miserably because the breach of the Memorandum Crows caveats were the stipulations for the free movement of people, capital, and so on, the freedoms of strategic flows were the foundation of the great sea power and liberal world order, was the foundation of the American strength and power. And that triggered also the alliance system. And this is the best advantage of the United States in the world is the system of alliances. If they shift towards the stance of the predatory hegemon, which seems short-term very convenient because one-on-one they are always stronger than everybody except China, Trump is really extracting from countries, including also from Poland. And because the allies live still in the former era of benign hegemony, then it's easy to extract. But America doesn't have sufficient standing residential power in Eurasia to be a land power. So it's completely unsustainable. It can be an empire. It would have to be an Eurasian empire. And it's never been. Let me remind you that the Americans won the First World War coming at the latest. It's the Chinese and the Soviets that defeated the Japanese, basically. I mean, they focused the main resource to the Japanese and the Germans. The First World War was the same. So this time around, America tries to be the first, like Iran likes that. This is a mistake. But at the same time, it can be predator on the wrong one. So this is number one. The scenario number two is the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Two blocks.
But for that to happen, the United States will need to convince the Europeans to join them. And given the current phase of the American economy, how structurally it is anti-European, I think the Western Europeans would be stupid that without incentives they would follow it. Or maybe they will do it because of ideology, but basically it's undoable. It will collapse the European economy. And I think this is misunderstood by the American strategists, that not appreciate properly the level of strategic thinking in Europe, which is still existing. And it's part of hubris, by the way, which is very, very often when you have been a hegemon for 100 years almost. So this is this. And the third scenario, where we have the systemic frictions everywhere. So this is the most probable scenario, with conflicting world, everybody almost against everybody, regional blocks, everything chaotic. So basically, this is what the world has been for many, many centuries. But it's very difficult to paint the path how we would get there. Anyway, we're in a systemic war. It will last like 15 years. and everything may happen, including the turnaround of alliances and stuff. So this is a predicament that I presume will happen.
Yeah, what fate might await Europe in each of these three scenarios? Given the current geopolitical circumstances, do the strategic interests of United States and Europe still align, or, like Jacek said, they increasingly diverging?
Well, they would align most closely in the first scenario, but I think as you pointed out, the challenge is that we're seeing more divergence between the United States and many of its European allies today than we're seeing convergence. And so it would take, I think, a shift of focus in Washington toward a strategy that was placed greater priority on sort of reconsolidating alliance blocks as part of a strategy of competition with China. I think there's very little U.S.-European cooperation in the third scenario, in part because the Europeans are the first people the U.S. is going to coerce in that scenario, in part because European countries have long been highly dependent on the United States economically and strategically. And so if you're President Trump and you're looking for someone to squeeze, it makes sense to start by squeezing the Europeans. And I think in the second scenario, the United States and Europe, they just sort of go their own ways. And so the United States would be primarily focused on the Western Hemisphere, perhaps with some residual commitment in Asia, where the competition with China will be sharpest. But in this scenario, the United States is basically pulling back from European security affairs. And so then it would really be up to the Europeans to determine what fate awaited them and whether we would get sort of European rearmament on a cohesive and collective basis, or whether we would get sort of a more jagged, fragmented approach to rearmament that happens largely on a national basis, whether you would get sufficient European cooperation to confront the threat from Russia or not. Those would essentially be questions that would be hashed out in Warsaw and Berlin and Brussels and Paris, as opposed to Washington at that point.
Basically, I agree. Let me remind our audience that the cooperation in the transatlantic world is quite a new phenomenon, right? After the Second World War, more or less, where the United States provided security, but it followed the logic of the Memorandum Crow caveats, where it opened its markets, capital flows, investment, and provided, the open economy between Europeans, some of them that were, were waging war against the United States in the Second World War. So it was quite an open system, a great incentive. And the threat of Soviet Union was paramount. Those underlying reasons are not anymore with us. And also American capitalism was production capitalism based on industry output of the United States. This time around, it's about financialization of the economy, so it's not in sync with the European needs and not in sync with the European export-driven economy. In case where there is trade war and United States broke the Memorandum Crow and is trying to tariff everyone and is trying to wage war against the main behemoth production empire of the world being China. And it's completely unsustainable, and the United States has never witnessed such a challenge strategically. And Europe is a status quo power, China is a status quo power, and US in this fashion is a revisionist power, and Russia is a revisionist power. Both those countries don't want to have the old system to operate further, while China and Europe want the globalized world to stay on the course. And this is a structural force that will drive us apart, okay? If there is no proper strategy on the part of the United States, but it's very difficult for me to imagine one.
Jacek mentioned about the very important issue, the regain of position of the most important industrial power. So the reindustrialization is the core point of Donald Trump's strategy, and
was there, I guess it was.
But do you believe that United States, that America have ability to restore their industrial advantages by using AI maybe and another industrial revolution?
I think it's unlikely the United States is going to get back to the position it had in the early post-World War II era, or even before that, where the United States was simply the world's dominant manufacturing powerhouse by far. I think that sort of era of American economic leadership is over. I think the questions are essentially twofold. Can the United States rebuild enough manufacturing capacity in the sectors that matter most economically and strategically so that it can hold its own in potentially a protracted competition with China? I think that's the experiment that's being run at the moment. And it relates to the second question, which is, to what degree will the U.S. be able to integrate its production, its manufacturing, its innovation with like-minded countries? Because the reality is that the United States is not going to be successful in developing the industrial scale and the technological scale to compete effectively with China by itself. It's going to need the help of friendly countries in East Asia and Europe and other areas where the United States has traditionally found its friends. We've seen some, I think, positive examples in this regard. One of the things I like about the AUKUS partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom is it basically reflects an effort to pool the defense industrial bases of these three democratic countries, not just so they can build submarines, but so they can build a variety of advanced military capabilities. And I think that's the sort of arrangement that it's going to require to be successful, whether you're thinking about shipbuilding, where the key partners are going to be countries like Japan and South Korea, or construction of icebreakers, where the Nordic countries will be very important, or drones, or a variety of other things. The United States will fare better if it is capable of pooling its manufacturing capabilities with countries that have overlapping strategic interests with Washington.
Mm-hmm. I'm asking you about the fate of Europe and about the future of Europe, but we are discussing now in Warsaw, so I won't ask you about the role and the fate of the Central and Eastern Europe. And maybe the point of reference still is your essay and your studies. What do you think about the future of the Central and Eastern Europe? Because you wrote many pieces and books about the Poland and about the intermarium. So
Okay, so there are three schools of thought. For our American guests to know, maybe there are three schools of thought in Poland as we speak. How to position ourselves in this new geopolitical era, right? The first is the old school of leaning on the United States, sometimes blindly, and probably you will meet those people in Warsaw, mostly. Because this is what, United States has been always winning the wars, it's winning all systemic wars, and stuff, so on. And let's just stick to it, right? Primacy will be renewed and everything will be fine. Those are older politicians usually. There is a second thought, but let's lean on the European Union. It's European kind of cornerstone. And my personal opinion, both are obsolete because of the new stance of the US and also uncertain future for the United States. Because you can withdraw. I spoke to Elbridge Colby on several occasions. He told, before he took office, and he said that offshore balancing is inevitable. So then we are doomed. We need to have another strategy. That's why I think that the war in Ukraine and the revolution military first that is rapidly happening, and also the relative weakness of Russia is pushing Poland towards the regional natural balancing system, where we, together with Sweden, Finland, and Ukraine, create sufficient curtail for the Russian influence, and we can defeat them militarily in conventional sense. Of course, we can discuss nuclear strategy and so on, maybe later, but it's good enough, and that's good. We don't need Germans, and we don't need this Western Europeans, and we don't need US. Actually, in that strategy, US is a hurdle, because US will try to control the escalation ladder, and we don't want it. Just like the Ukrainians proved that they don't want to have any control. Long-range strike, deep strike. And then we should change the procurement, we should change the ways we operate, and we should also change the military. not to be an auxiliary force for NATO or US, but our independent force like Ukrainians have, and and it's good enough. This is what I propose, and that's, I think, the only way forward. Let alone that it's flexible enough to take on the train if US really wins a systemic war or Europeans make the separate decision. Whatever happens, we're still flexible, right? And still we control the confrontation with Russia. And Poland is powerful enough, has human capital sufficient, and what it lacks is this ambitious move forward to understand that we are in a new reality. So that's the way forward, and that would create intermarium, and in the longer run, that would be also beneficial for the United States if the United States withdraw or be in offshore balancing or whatever, or be just only temporarily present here or there as a kind of British did in the 19th century, to be here or there, just balancing system.
Mm-hmm. On the beginning of our discussion, I mentioned that you are author of this book, Eurasian Century, and in this book you wrote about the heritage of John Halford Mackinder and also Nicholas Spikeman. So, what place does Central and Eastern Europe occupy in U.S. grand strategy? In Washington's strategic thinking about the region influenced in many ways by the ideas put forward more than a century ago by Halford Mackinder, or does American strategic culture more strongly reflect Nicholas Spikeman belief that what is crucial for United States is the consolidation of its influence in Western Europe, while Central and Eastern Europe remains some contested zone that maybe become a subject of negotiation with Russia?
I think what's interesting about Central and Eastern Europe is that the region sort of matters regardless of whether you are a neo-Mackinderite or a neo-Spikemanite. And so, just to sort of simplify this quite a bit, Mackinder's initial fear was that a power would come roaring out of the pivot area or the heartland. He had Russia in mind mostly, and would basically push into the adjoining industrial regions in Europe, and then would use hegemony over the Eurasian landmass to seek supremacy in the world. And he was writing in the early 20th century when, in many ways, the chief preoccupation for British strategists was still Russian expansion as opposed to anything else. Spikeman was writing in the late 1930s and 1940s, and he was writing from an American perspective. And so the phenomenon that he was observing was one in which rimland powers, so basically Germany and Japan, were expanding outward toward and across the ocean while also pushing into Eurasia. And so it was sort of an inversion of the Mackinder hypothesis. But what's interesting, of course, is that in either way you look at it, Eastern Europe is a central region because it's essentially the gateway you have to go to get from the heartland into the rimland, or vice versa. You cannot establish Eurasian hegemony without essentially establishing mastery over the gateway region of Eastern Europe. And in many ways, I think that has been a guiding theme of American strategic thinking for some time. After the Cold War ended, one of the reasons the United States was enthusiastic about expanding NATO was that it would essentially push the frontier of the West farther east toward Russia and make it harder for a resurgent Russia to assert supremacy over the states of the former Soviet Empire. It would also tamp down on tensions within Europe itself, particularly related to a unified Germany. And I think that strategy was effective as far as it went. But I think, as our discussion of the last couple of questions indicates, there's arisen real uncertainty as to whether the United States still defines its interests in such an expansive way anymore. And just to be candid, and I think provocative, I think President Trump has very little interest in the security of Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. And you see this when there are Russian drone incursions into the Baltic, or a Russian drone hits an apartment building in Romania, as we saw last month. You'll get statements of condemnation from the U.S. ambassador to NATO, but you really don't hear much about from the White House out of this. I think the president just thinks of this as sort of a faraway region that matters relatively little. And so that creates a situation where there's growing uncertainty about what is the U.S. commitment to European security? What will the U.S. commitment look like a decade from now? And that's catalyzing a lot of ferment within European strategic communities about the policies that their countries need to pursue. I'll simply say, I think it is a good thing to have better armed, somewhat more independent-minded allies on the eastern flank of NATO. I think that throws up greater barriers to Russian power. I think you can imagine various configurations where you would have very strong groupings of, say, Eastern European and Nordic states that still have some strategic tie to the United States, that gives the United States some degree of access and influence, provides a certain backstop to local capabilities. That would be an acceptable arrangement from my perspective. I think the challenge is that we simply don't know whether that's what it's going to look like a decade from now, or whether the U.S. may have disengaged more thoroughly even than that.
Yeah, actually, the both Spikeman and Mackinder theses proved right in their own right, let me put it that way, depending on the length and width of the American power. And of course, interests that is usually aligned with power at disposal. And Poland was a victim of this kind of scaling down, scaling up. And that's why the school of thought number one heavily leans on the US to really make sure that this time around it's not happening, and they are begging you all the time just to be here, whatever it costs. The real solution to the Polish strategic dilemma is not the United States itself, it's Poland and its strategic culture itself, and abandoning our peripheral mindset, and the understanding that Russia could be defeated, that the United States is interested in strategic stability with Russia, while Poland is not. Okay? And that was evident during Anchorage meeting. And Poland didn't get it yet at that time, because otherwise we would be opposing it staunchly, saying to the US that peace is not possible without Poland. You can't have the discussion with Russia without our yes. We can say we can defeat this peace by our own capabilities. And that's the way forward for Poland, just like Ukrainians did. And this will happen if the erosion of the US power is broadening, is more and more evident. And there will be a question of also nuclear proliferation and withdrawal from NPT, not only Poland, but most European countries, to the leverage the influence the United States has on Europe and Russia has on Europe, overscale influence because of the nuclear capabilities, and relative easiness with which European countries may get hands on nuclear proliferation. There might be also situations where the United States will be interested in changing its posture since 1941 and allowing some allies to have nuclear. Well, let's call it shelter pursuit, that they will move away the head, pretending they are not seeing it, especially when the offshore balancing is placed and countries like Poland, along with the Mackinder or relatively Spikeman's propositions, would be a key role player to block the continental consolidation. And then the United States will be interested in changing the NPT very stiff rules. So that might be in the future, regardless of Trump and so on. But this is true, that Mackinder is very much alive in Polish minds, and Spikeman as well. One more sentence. Poles, including Marshal Piłsudski, who realized that, he spoke to Mackinder during the war, and Mackinder was trying to convince him to defeat the Reds, to save the Whites.
Yeah.
And because Piłsudski was the son of the Polish eastern frontier and a boy from the mansion house and our old nobility, he said no, because he was not a peripheral guy who followed the Entente. He knew what the destiny of the country is and what was the old Commonwealth. And he said no, and he was right. And he was right, because the Whites would ally with Entente, and our breathing space for independence and agency would be limited or even eliminated. And he knew it. So he was right, and our American friends should always remember that Poles will think about it. Okay, so it's not easy to instrumentalize Poles in that respect because of McKinney already tried once. Okay, so there is intermarium and there is intermarium. You know, there is this belt of lands and there is this belt of lands, depending whose purpose they serve. Okay, if we are just only the buffer zone for the U.S. interests, it may not work out. But if it's a real belt of countries that create their own gravity, it may work.
Both of you touch a very important but sensitive things. The future of American nuclear umbrella and non-proliferation treaty, and also the relation between the United States and its partners and allies. So first of all, I want to ask you about the alliances. As the United States seeks the shift of greater responsibility for security onto its partners and allies, is it prepared for the possible consequences of this policy, namely the emergence of the number of allied states as more independent geopolitical actors, which on many issues may no longer act in close coordination with Washington? In other words, can United States continue to maintain its current level of political influence while offering less and less in return?
No, I don't think the U.S. is prepared for that. I don't think American policymakers have seriously grappled with what that means. And so we can all have a debate about what the proper distribution of burdens is within U.S.-led alliances. And I think that, to give President Trump some credit, he was correct in 2016 and 2017 that levels of military spending we were seeing from countries like Germany and Japan were just not going to be adequate in terms of making U.S. alliances fair and making them robust over time. That said, I am not convinced that the Trump administration, and particularly the president himself, has thought through the implications of what you just spelled out, which is that if you create an environment where U.S. allies, one, are no longer convinced that they can count on the United States coming to help in a crisis, two, are spending dramatically more on their own militaries because they feel that they have no choice but to do so, and three, are living in an international environment that grows more chaotic, more violent, more disordered all the time, those countries are going to become less responsive to U.S. strategic interests, U.S. strategic guidance, whatever you want to call it, over time. And that may result in national nuclear proliferation. You hear very active debates about this in places like South Korea right now. There are quieter debates in Japan. Obviously, Europe is having its own debate about the future of nuclear deterrence as the transatlantic alliance grows more strained. You're going to see it on issues like the Ukraine war, where you're increasingly going to have U.S. allies who will simply say, look, we're not going to follow the American lead on this because we believe we have a compelling interest in supporting Ukraine and protecting it from the sort of peace that the United States has occasionally tried to impose over the past 18 months. And you'll see it in a variety of other areas as well. And so, my candid view is that President Trump views higher levels of allied military spending as an unalloyed good, right? That it's simply allies paying more for American protection, and that's a good thing. But I'm not sure that he or anyone else has fully thought through what it's going to mean when you have allies that have armed themselves much more heavily at the same time that they've become much less confident in American protection.
Yeah, also I would address this issue in a quite defying way that some in European capitals think that this U.S. approach is an exit scam. When you have an exit scam, is that you're not going to be there, but at least make some money. Okay, so this increase, because strategically there is no reason why the United States should be balancing Russia now. Russia is a weak power. Ukraine almost defeated Russia. There are rich countries here, so why the heck? and nuclear deterrence provided by US is completely not credible because of the distinction in stakes and risks involved. That means what DC against Warsaw and so on. This. So if the US is withdrawing anyway, although rhetorically they are saying they are not, so let's at least make some money. This might be the Trump's opinion. I'm not of this opinion, actually. I think that there is some strategic thinking there from, Colby or other guys, including Rubio, and instinctively Americans are trying to reduce the cost of imperial presence in places like Europe, increasingly like Europe, because they see Russia is not capable of defeating entire Europe, but also keeping the same agency and influence on the ground. And that is a balancing game. While in this new phase of predatory hegemony, when the Americans are extracting concessions, so allies, countries like Poland, should issue invoices for obedience, So the invoices should be the other way around also, because there is always a cost of the imperial presence, and the United States doesn't want to cover those, okay? So this is this kind of a game. And I think it's only about the cost of the imperial presence and agency, because the United States leadership doesn't believe that Russia is really a threat to Europe itself, especially now. Especially if we believe that the guys from the Marathon Initiative, including the U.S. Mitchell, was right, and in his essay launched right before the Ukraine war about the sequencing strategy. So the first sequence is fulfilled. Yeah, Russia is kind of weakened. So what the heck should we invest blood, treasure, and stuff? Let's extract something, from this situation by manipulating that you guys need security and our equipment, yeah? And let's simply focus on strategic stability with Russia, and that creates space for us manipulating Russians against Chinese in a way, and still keeping our hands off the problem, and discussing over European hand. And this situation is unsustainable for sound strategic thinkers in Europe. I wonder how come they can come to terms with that, and it's completely, I've been waiting for already 1 year to wait until someone's calling this bluff to the Americans, like Zelensky did, basically. He did. And that's why the Americans tried to topple him 3 times.
Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, my last question, it will be about the core issue of this phase of great power rivalry about US and China. Under what circumstances could US and China rivalry escalate into open military confrontation? In US deterrence policy toward China, where does the line lie between actions that Beijing may perceive as provocative and excessive restraint, both of which could ultimately produce the same result, the failure of deterrence?
Well, the most sort of alarming and obvious circumstance in which the U.S.-China rivalry could escalate into conflict would be a Taiwan crisis. And if you look at the military modernization that China has carried out over the past couple of decades, if you look at the increasing assertiveness of Chinese policy around Taiwan, having to do with everything from more aggressive military exercises to continual cyber intrusions and other forms of pressure, it's not crazy to think that there could be a significant Taiwan crisis as early as the last couple of years of this decade. Some people have argued 2027 would be the key date. That's a PLA military modernization target, or 2028 because that's when Taiwan will have its next presidential election, and so on and so forth. The precise dates aren't that important. The important thing is that we're moving into a phase of the rivalry where China is becoming more ambitious, more willing to push the limits geopolitically in the Western Pacific, and that will create some danger of escalation. I think the task for the United States is essentially to blend deterrence and reassurance. And so the U.S., together with its allies, as well as Taiwan, needs to make a fight over Taiwan, whether that is something that involves a blockade or a quarantine or something that involves a full-scale invasion look as unappetizing as possible from Xi Jinping's perspective, so that he never thinks that taking Taiwan will be quick or easy. He thinks it'll be something long, bloody, likely to fail, and perhaps likely to endanger his regime. At the same time, the reassurance bit of that is to avoid doing things that would convince Xi Jinping that Taiwan is simply slipping away forever unless he uses force in the near term. And this is one of the reasons the United States has long opposed a Taiwanese declaration of independence. It has long had this policy of strategic ambiguity, which is meant to deter both Beijing and Taipei from challenging the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And I think that's still basically the right formula. The issue is just that you're going to have to reweight the deterrence and reassurance bits of the equation as the Chinese military challenge gets stronger. And I think one of the problems that the U.S. has in front of it is that China has been improving its military capabilities more quickly than the U.S. and its allies have been improving their military capabilities and their ability to respond to Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific. And so that feeds into the danger that you could get a moment late this decade, perhaps at the beginning of the next decade, when military adventurism looks a little bit more appealing from Xi Jinping's perspective. And unfortunately, to tie this back to where we began, the Iran war compounds that dynamic, because it forced the United States to spend down large amounts of munitions and interceptors that would be relevant in a Western Pacific context, all in the service of an outcome that was unsatisfying at best. And so to the degree that the U.S. was already going to face a crisis of deterrence in the Western Pacific as we get to the end of the 2020s, that dynamic has probably become more pronounced as a result of recent events.
Mhm. Jacek?
It's a very tough question. And I've been changing my opinion about it many times already. I think that in last autumn, the Trump's office, people around Trump, decision-making circles in the United States realized that they had lost the first phase of the systemic war, trade war and technological war to China. Basically, it didn't work. The tariff war didn't work. China won it. So they changed the strategy, and they adopted a better one, using two instruments of great power the United States has. I mean, the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar and institutions that were born with it and then grew with it. It's a huge, huge monopolized power of the world. And also its powerful military of planetary dimensions and reach. And they use it against the guys in South America, also blockaded Cuba. And he wanted to use the same against Iran to show that the Americans are controlling the energy supplies and the price in the markets in this way, and they can curtail China. And on top of that, if they had had good discussions with Russia, that would really create serious issues for China, and that was the deal. But fortunately, and that would lead us to war, basically, if it continued. And if the United States defeated Iran and really installed a regime change and put the puppet regime and control the flows of oil, and it was probed already, they would start negotiating with Indonesia, the same kind of defensive pact over the Indonesian Straits. I think that could lead us to war between US and China, starting with some skirmishes or some, who controls the convoy, the blockade, not blockade, some things like that, out of the blue. Because for the Chinese, that would create Malacca dilemma and stuff, the threat of distant blockade of the Western Pacific. It's unsustainable for the leadership in Beijing, especially with the Russians kind of trying to have some grounds with some discussions with the US. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two, where the war could be possible, is if Europe were to be subjugated by the United States, and the United States decided to start a financial war against China, with the pretext that no access to US dollar. That's it. China's, you're done, and nobody can trade with China, or it's excluded from the dollar system. And then we had the war. Probably we had the war because the Chinese would then blockade the movements of goods across Western Pacific, and we will have the war. And I think those two scenarios, in a way, in some modified way, are still on the table. Especially, and this is my last sentence, is that right around the war in Iran, the American leadership to turn very militaristic. I'm sorry to say that, but if you listen to Hexed and other guys, they were speaking like, revisionist power, fleshing the muscles. Yeah, I mean, it's really like the old era thing, that you could hear in your ears, and so proud, full of hubris about the military power of the United States. Fortunately, the US lost this war because it didn't understand the geography of the Gulf. Plus, due to the anti-aerial capabilities and the mass precision revolution that was also displayed in Ukraine and in Gulf, the United States military couldn't stomach the scale and strategic consequence of this war, which is in a way, a bad sign for Poland, if we follow the belief in the US primacy, but it stabilized, it helped stabilize the system a little bit. That's my opinion. So that's my answer.
Gentlemen, my last question may be more general to both of you. How United States, at both sides of this current phase of systemic rivalry between United States and China, how Washington and Beijing define the victory in this phase of confrontation?
I mean, the theory of victory.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think China's vision of victory is fairly clear. I mean, Xi Jinping talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It refers to a scenario in which China has essentially kicked the United States out of Asia strategically and made itself the world's leading strategic and economic power by the time we get to the middle of this century. I think the U.S. theory of victory is much more muddled at this point. If you go back to the Biden administration, whether you liked it or didn't like it, I think there was a theory of success, which is that the U.S. would basically try to work closely with allies and partners in the Asia Pacific and also in Europe to generate the collective pushback and collective scale necessary to prevent China from essentially disrupting the international system that the United States had built. There are, I think, diverging views of what success looks like in the United States. I think President Trump sometimes views China as an economic and strategic competitor. I think sometimes he views China as sort of this other member of the G2, this global board of directors with which the United States will sort of sort out international affairs. Sometimes he looks like he's gearing up for a new Cold War. Sometimes he looks like all he wants is a really terrific trade deal. I think there are conflicting views of what the United States wants. What if you go to the Pentagon as opposed to talking to some of the president's economic advisors? And so I think one of the challenges the U.S. faces right now is that it's simply far less clear where the United States is going or where it's trying to go in its relationship with China than it was under the Biden administration, or even to some degree in Trump's first term.
Mm-hmm. That's it.
I think that for the Chinese, it's more internal, but it has huge external consequences. Simply, the Chinese leadership believes that scale of possibilities and scale of capabilities, Chinese society, which numbers over 1 billion, is not yet fulfilled. So they need to keep expanding, growing, and taking higher places in the value chains of the world, because for them it's a natural phenomenon that China is Zhonghua, the Middle Kingdom, at the center of the economic system of the world, and for that they need to keep globalization going, so that they have markets, they have resources, the system is open, right? And it's driven by the internal pressure of the Chinese, who really want to get richer and richer and richer and richer and richer, just like the Bismarck's Germany and after Bismarck Germany. And there is a hurdle. There's an obstacle on the way, is the United States and its leadership role in the global system and its global capitalism. And the problem is that so the Chinese objective is just keep the globalization going and everything will happen by itself, because the Chinese think that by scale and innovation of the society, they will grow anyway. But the opposing force that will stop it is the United States. So they preemptively are preparing for that clash. And in a way, they are right, because they don't have this primacy thinking. The Chinese primacy is not doable because of the regional foes that they face and how Eurasia is constructed. So it was only US primacy that was possible because of the remoteness of the United States across the ocean and this exceptional role after the World Wars. So it's not doable, but for the United States to accept this rise of China, it's undoable unless United States, as Lynn Alden argues, retreats to North America and becomes the country, not the empire. But the problem is that then the barons of cyber AI and stuff and Wall Street would kill the quote. I mean, it's a metaphor. Would not opt for that. So the American leadership is driven by the limited resources and capability to really face the tense competition with China and capitalism, and at the same time by the financial elements of their economy that wants to have the market and that wants to dominate the markets of the world. And this is, it was the same with Great Britain prior to the First World War. It's a very dangerous phenomenon that Mackinder also described in his book. And I think that the United States simply got used to being at the center of the world capitalism with the yields and the control of the cycles of innovation, of capital investment and institutions and so on. And there is a great layer of people in the US that Trump wanted to eradicate in the first term, but in the second term he betrayed MAGA and became part of this circle, kind of, that tell him not to give up on it. And so that's why I also don't have a clear picture what the United States want to achieve at the end. I know what they want to stop from happening. This is the rise of China. That's it. Mm-hmm. And we all face structural consequences of this tension.
Yeah. Last sentence, Professor Brands, to sum up our discussion.
I think we're entering an era where there's going to be a high level of geopolitical volatility for some time to come, where we're going to see persistent crises in many, if not all, the key theaters of Eurasia at once, and all that's going to be overlaid by deep uncertainty about what role the United States will play in the international system a decade or more from now.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you, both of you. Professor Hal Brands, thank you, and Dr. Jacek Bartosiak. Please stay with us with Układ Sił. Thank you.